Hello and welcome to Inflection Point Conversations. I'm Michelle Obeda. I'm a 3D artist and the host of this podcast. I'll be chatting with different people who are experts in various CGI fields. Together, we'll take a deep dive into one or more of the disruptive topics that have reached an inflection point in our industry. If you're enjoying this podcast, please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe. You can also comment and give feedback. I would love to reach more people and grow this amazing community. Today, I have my first ever returning guest, Hassan Ragab. Hassan is an interdisciplinary designer, architect, and conceptual artist, exploring the intersection of art, technology, and humanity. His work delves into themes of identity, heritage, and the evolving role of creativity in a rapidly changing world. Combining generative AI with traditional design processes, he challenges conventional aesthetics while raising questions about the societal and cultural implications of technology. Driven by a desire to provoke thought and inspire dialogue, Hassan's practice focuses on using innovation as a tool to reimagine how we perceive ourselves and the environments we create. I spoke with Hassan a year ago about the art he makes with generative AI, and he's come back on the podcast to discuss with me the subject of identity on the verge of collapse. Welcome, Hassan.
Hello, Michelle. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming back. So, yeah, we were just talking before I started recording that it was like over a year ago since you came on, and we were talking. I've been following your art for a while, and we were talking a lot more about AI and I guess the processes of the art that you've been making, which is really interesting. And I still like to talk about that, but you've been doing so much more with this process. And I guess like doing different collections and stuff. And the thing that's really interesting me is this sort of visual aesthetic as cultural identity and the idea of this identity on the verge of collapse. And like, how do we challenge visual biases in AI, like to maintain a cultural identity? So I found this fascinating, and I love the work that you've been producing. I guess in the last year that has been more and more impactful.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, like for me, it's only it only makes sense to start to challenge AI right now. Like basically, I think like everybody started to create everything. So now what's the point of creating anyway? So you need to kind of
Yeah.
really want to like understand the tool to like push them further, like push their development further in like in any direction, basically. I don't want to say a positive direction because I have no idea what's a positive direction at that point. But for me, it's just like this seemed like a very interesting topic to explore. It's really challenging, so maybe that's why I like it.
Yeah. So, just as a background, for anyone who didn't listen to your first podcast here, you have a background in architecture and engineering, right? And you're Egyptian, and you live in LA right
Yeah,
now,
Orange
in
County, yeah,
California,
yeah,
Orange County.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
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 Um, and so, like, why is cultural identity important to you? Why is it a topic that you come back to?
Um, there are so many answers, but right now I'm trying to ask the question like, why cultural identities are important in the first place, not only for me. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know. For me, it's always interesting to ask the question in a collective manner, so not in a personal manner. Um, so, like, I know for me, I know there are reasons for me why identities are important. Maybe one of the reasons why is because, like, I have immigrated to the U.S. and now this is like basically where I live. I don't know if I'll ever come back to Egypt. And that poses a question of like who you are and what do you want to do. And also interesting because like I have a 5 year old and he's growing up. He never like he'd been to Egypt for like 3 or 4 months of his life. So is he Egyptian? Is he American? And how will that impact him and impact the relationship between me and him and like his mother? His mother is also Egyptian, grew up in the same city. Um, and again, this kind of ties up to the whole how the world is changing right now. Um, what we believe is basically a mix between where we live and where we live right now, and how these ideas kind of mix together. Um, Cultural identities, like they bring people together, but they separate people apart. Uh,
Hmm.
my interest basically in the visual vocabulary and how identity kind of changes this vocabulary, because again, I'm an architect, so I'm not an anthropologist, but
Mm-hmm.
I can't separate these things, unfortunately. Like whenever I try to only focus on like, the visual, there's always this intangible part of it. And with AI, it's like discovering the intangible identity is something that I think like I'm seeing a lot of potential in. I see that
Yeah.
something not being challenged very often. And I think that our current visual vocabulary for architecture and design, they are not helping people very much. Um,
Yeah. What do you mean? I'd like to delve into that a little bit more. In what way do you feel like architectural language or architectural vocabulary isn't helping people?
um, well, it's not because I most people don't live in places where they like, you know. If
Mm.
you look at the design, like the architectural scene right now, um, there is this kind of like, the commercial housing, like people kind of live in the same way almost everywhere. You can
Mm-hmm.
only live in a good place if you have a lot of money. And if you have a lot of money, you will follow certain aesthetics, which like mostly Western aesthetics, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically like postmodern, postmodern um, trend, or basically maybe after that, if you're like really, really rich and crazy, you live like in a maximalist house and you'll start to design like this crazy thing. Or capital E architecture, which basically, the monopoly of like certain architectural offices and studios, mostly based in London, or like, in Denmark, or even here in the US, which all about like creating more projects that are, I don't know, like that are just uh it very, very exaggerating in like the materials that they use, very, very exaggerating in how they want to create like this impossible shapes.
Mm.
Like for me, the
Mm-hmm.
Zaha Hadid style is at one point similar to like, the AI boom in social media. Everybody want to create the same thing and nobody knows why.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
this is not serving. I fail to see the point how creating like these kind of buildings help the general population. Only
Mm.
because they want to see something like that is, I don't know, interesting and good. Well, what it takes to build these buildings, it's
Mm.
just not worth it, in my opinion. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, that's why I actually like not doing like typical architecture anymore, because I just can't create something like I don't believe in, I don't like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's kind of like the language and like you said, like the vocabulary of architecture can be really sort of empty a little bit or like a little bit pointless, like with trends. So if there's a trend of, buildings looking a certain way or using certain materials, it doesn't have much depth to it. Is that that's kind of
Yeah,
what you mean?
it is industrialized in a very great way. So think about it like
Mm-hmm.
we are building to make money, and people are the resources that we get the money from. So that's why what I'm trying to say. Like it's not really helping people. People need
Yeah.
houses, so we will try to sell it to them in a capitalist way. And like the more money that you have, the better quality that you get. But again, you are you are confined by certain static. You're confined by certain way of building, because that's like the optimized way to make money for these studios, or like for the contractors or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I understand what you mean. Let's take it back a little bit. Like, I want to ask you about like the idea of cultural identity. What to you are like the biggest signifiers of cultural identity? Like, sometimes we think about food, language, architectural style, fashion, these things are kind of signify certain cultures. Um, do you think that there's like one of those is more important than the other, or do you think there's more things to add to that list in terms of what is like culture?
Well, if we want to go like, or if I want to think about it in an abstract way, what brings people together will be either ideologies or demographics. And
Mm-hmm.
like the mix between both, that's kind of what's like, what spreads out like the other thing, like what food that they like, what like, what kind of houses they like to live in. But I think in a world that we live in right now, I think the greatest element that brings people together is ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
uh, so like, yeah, maybe you can be with people like, or that you feel like you belong to them, but they don't speak even the same language. But you feel like you relate to
Mm.
them, so you'll be with them, and then you will form some kind of a culture. And this is something that I think didn't happen like until like, globalization, and like people started to move to other countries like easily now, and then there will be media, and then the social media, um, and which really, really interesting because I have no idea what identities like really are and what they are important. What's really interesting, in my opinion, what I really like to um, focus on, or like basically, observe, is
Hmm.
how like all of these ideas gotta come together and form like this new thing that we can't just put a label on, but it's like controlling our lives. So I think
Mm.
like the big signifier for a culture now, I think it will be ideology. It must be.
Mm. So interesting because I guess before like mass globalization, when people lived in areas and they moved around, slowly, let's say, um, you had to live around people to who who were like-minded. Like so your culture were people who you were interacted with. And then more and more, I guess, with the internet and with and with people being able to move, like let's say you grew up in a country, but you feel like I feel more similar to people in this other country. I'm going to move there and be around my people. But now you can have your culture online. Like you can find your people online, right? Like if there's something small, there's some kind of really weird thing that you love doing, you can find like a handful of people who love doing that too. You can find like hundreds of people who love doing that too online, and your culture doesn't have to be geographical, basically. So I wonder whether there's interesting like clash between your geographical culture, like the people around you physically, and the people who you identify more with who maybe are nowhere near you. Do you think that I feel like, because that's at odds with architecture in a way, because architecture is grounded. Um, and, you could live in a place and be surrounded by buildings, but you don't feel like it's represents you. I don't know. That's an interesting idea.
I mean, architecture won't represent you if you have other models or if you're seeing other like architectural styles and you feel more represented by like, I think one great example of that is like how teenagers kind of go and do like, graffiti on the wall, like basically a graffiti
Mm,
artist, because like they don't like, the concrete, they don't like how real it is. And now they start doing that. And I think
yeah.
again, this happened because of how technology enabled like these young people to perceive other possible scenarios that they can live without.
Hmm.
Like for example, I think like um, I think it was Erich Fromm that he was talking about in one of his books that like before the 18th century, before the Renaissance era, if you were the son of like a farmer, you'll become a farmer. If you were like a son of a king, you'll become like a prince. If you were like
Hmm.
a son of a priest, you'll probably become a priest. There wasn't much choice between like a generation and the next generation, but
Hmm.
now you have like more choices. Like now, like there is nothing that will say that my son will become an artist or like an architect because I'm an architect. And the same thing, like there was a gap between me and my father, and now the gap is even bigger between me and my son, and that's because of technology. And this
Hmm.
technology kind of enabling people, you're not only bounded by where you live or like your parents or your friends. No, you have the whole world in front of you. And that's like
Hmm.
a big impact on like people trying to understand who I am and what I really need to go. So technology is like a big factor in shaping on our ideology and shaping basically our paradigm.
So I guess also your artwork is massively shaped by technology. Did you feel like when you started using generative AI that you started making different kind of art? Like, did the technology inform the kind of art that you're making?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it yeah, I do want to call it artist. Like I'm kind of seeking potential or like seeking something that's new. Like, I think I was stuck
Mm-hmm.
at one point with the aesthetics and I don't know what to do with them. Like I was like I'm a computational designer, but again, like the aesthetics were very, very geometric in my opinion. Like at one point,
Mm-hmm.
it just was all about geometry, and for me, that wasn't enough. I wasn't like the best computational designer, but again, when I see what other people do, it's just like, yeah, this is really cool, but it's not really interesting because it's still like confined within some form of a boundary. With AI, there's like the boundary has been broken for me. It's just like now it's unlocked, and now like there's a new potential that we can really see. Um, I don't think I'll be even talking with you without without me using AI. AI is basically shaping. the whole thing not only about my work but also how I think and what I believe.
Yeah, I guess because I mean it's been like a hot topic. Like when I first started this podcast over a year ago,
Yeah,
it was first about AI. I mean that was like the main topic and discussing with people, where do you think this is going? And I feel like now that's shifted a lot, into more like what are you trying to say with it, and how is it, how is the technology, the ever-changing technology. I feel like we're also like trying to
yeah,
keep up with it. Like people who weren't necessarily using AI day to day are trying to keep up with what was new. And now I don't even feel like I need to keep up with it. I'm more interested in what I'm seeing that has been made with it, good and bad. I'm definitely, I mean, what do you think about that? Have you been witnessing or feeling any sort of sense of this is not a great use of AI versus this is a really good use of AI?
um, well, like on a personal level or like in a personal aesthetic, there's a lot of things that's coming out of AI that I really don't like, sometimes including even my own work. But on the other hand, I think we're still in this phase of like really exploring what the tool can do. Uh, Basically, not what the tool can do. I think we're coming to a point because I think there's some kind of a plateau, especially in the image generation and maybe like in the video generation as well. There's like some kind of a plateau of like what these tools can really do.
Hmm.
Like for example, Midjourney, the last release that they have released almost like from a year ago, and they haven't released a newer model since then.
Yeah.
So when you reach that point, and for a year was this kind of technology that was changing every month, and now it's kind of plateauing for a year, and like instead of like the image generation is like plateauing, but the 3D is like coming to like AI to 3D or text to 3D or image to 3D, or like video generations, like models are like coming better and better with like the quality that they produce. So now you start thinking, okay, there is so much that I can do with it, but what I how can I really drive it for what you're saying? Like basically what we were saying is that
Mm.
like why am I creating this? And I think
Yeah.
we're in that point, and for me it's really hard to judge people like what's good and what's bad. For me, I know there are some stuff that are bad, but there's always something that's good, whether it's like in the technique or like
Yeah.
whether like how they use the tool, how they drove it. But yeah, I mean AI like is a is a tool that lets everybody use it. So of course you'll get like bad stuff out of it, especially combined with
Yeah.
social media. So
Yeah. 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 Because I guess that, as someone, who, like as a viewer, like I'm gonna see all the kinds of things. So then, I see a lot of AI images, and I guess you stood out not just to me, but lots of my friends noticed your work above other people's quite early on because you were saying something with the art. So it was more about the intention and the messaging, rather than a lot of interesting visuals, which just became visuals. You're like, oh, wow, that was cool. That was made by AI. Now that's not that interesting that it was made by AI. It's like that's just another image that looks maybe like it's AI. I'd like to talk to you a little bit also about the sort of cultural bias in AI, because we talked about it before. I know you've talked about it quite a lot. Um, and the idea that, like, let's say you put in, I don't know, you put in an architect, and it might come up with someone who looks a certain way, or like you put in, a doctor and it looks like someone a certain way, or you put in a place, and there are biases towards maybe like white males in professions of like architecture or medical medicine, whatever. So there are definitely like gender biases, racial biases, cultural biases, and the cultural bias thing is interesting, and I think that's the thing that you have been kind of making a message with your art, right? Um, what how do you feel about the cultural bias in AI now? And like, do you think that your work is having an impact in it, in just the producing images, like you're adding to the images that are being used?
well, first of all, I don't think I'm trying to like I'm not trying to say a message here really. I hate seeing messages, and I hate like
Sure.
yeah, I hate that. It just doesn't make sense to me. I'm just like trying to explore what we're like basically a tool that we're using. Maybe when I think about it sometimes when I post something or write an article, I have an interview, maybe I will show this part where like I'm trying to really say something in a form of a message or like a guidance, but I really don't want to do that. Uh, and that's because basically I'm really trying to explore what the hell is this is in the first
Yeah.
place. Um, for like, can you repeat the question? I was really focused on like trying to say that
Yeah.
this is not a message and that I forgot the question.
Yeah. No, I think I asked about 25 questions in that. Just about like cultural bias with AI. So let's say like in a negative way, cultural bias can be people will type in something like you'll type in a prompt into Midjourney and it'll come up with something that will be very skewed to a certain culture. So, do you think that's changed? Do you think that that's sort of a bad thing with AI technology, or do you think that that's something that can be improved on?
Well, bias is basically human. Like I think, like I like to think about big AI models are basically why I use big AI models and why I don't train my own AI models is that I see like these models a reflection to like a collective being of our consciousness in a way. So
Mm-hmm.
if AI is kind of biased because it's trained on the data that is generated by a biased being, which is humans. Um, so I'm 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 not trying to look at bias as like either a good or a bad thing, but it's something that it's there, and there are
Mm-hmm.
reasons why there are biases, and these reasons were bound to happen. Again, I don't look at them like whether they are good or bad. Sometimes there are bad results that can come out of bias, but sometimes there are good things that can come out of bias. So like for me, like even like from like even from your accent, I have to assume that you're from England or like you're born in England, but you're more than that. But this spice kind of helped me out to like see a friction of who you are, but it didn't allow me to see the whole picture of like
Mm-hmm.
what you do. It's the same thing with like generative AI. When I work with generative AI, it's like for me a way to try to explore our collective bias. Um, and it in the beginning again because basically maybe because I am affected by the bias because like again, maybe my demographic because like I'm an Arabic, maybe because the styles that I like or the styles that I like grew up like admiring in my country, maybe they don't like exist as much in the data set. Maybe if I was like English and born in London or Katahadi, maybe I won't really be bothered with like this whole thing. Um, but for me, like maybe I was bothered at the beginning, but after a while, I thought like, hey, maybe I can actually use this bias
Mm-hmm.
because biases are true in one sense or another. Like
Yeah.
like people like assume a lot of things about Egyptians. Some of them are true, and some of them, of course, are like not true. They're stupid, but like the true things that they assume, they actually a good reflection of us. That like Egyptians aren't even aware of it. So for us
Mm-hmm.
to see bias, like for me at least, like when I explore AI and like explore this kind of bias, it
Yeah.
informs me some in a way it might inform me more about like where I come from in an honest way. Uh,
That's interesting. Yeah, can you give me an example of that? Like an example of something that you think like is true about the bias in Egyptian kind of culture, like you mentioned.
uh,
I'm putting you on the spot.
maybe. Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I'm thinking yeah, maybe there's like a better example of that. So of like how kind of like AI can be like truthful. Maybe it's better than
Hmm.
Egypt. So like I'm gonna get political for a second, but like let me know if you don't want to do that. Um, I during like what happened like in October in 2023 in Gaza and
Yeah.
Palestine, like the very first like few days, there was like on the Western media they were saying like nothing is happening in Gaza, there's no destruction and whatsoever. Nobody was covering anything. But it was interesting because if you went into Midjourney at that point and you typed in Gaza, Palestine, you will find an images of a destroyed city. Like you'll see like
Mm,
ruins. And this was like 3 or 4 days before. So at one point, the AI was actually more truthful than the news outlets. You know,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think like that's the biggest example for me. And for me, that was like a moment of realization. Okay, that's not just like something that is spitting out like images or art or outputs. It's spitting something that is more collective. It's spitting something
Mm,
that out that is interesting that we need to look at like in a more details. And I think since
yeah.
then, like like when I started to search about stuff like related, like for example, like certain places in Cairo, and you can see how like the streets are formed. You see how like sometimes I don't know, in my artwork you can see a lot of people that's kind of crowded. Like there are like a lot of people like
Yep.
brought together, and like they are interacting with the facade one way or another. For me,
Yep.
it's not the truth, but it's like some form of like an intangible truth,
Yes.
and it's again it's because of bias, because Cairo is not only like these like it's not like downtown Cairo, or like it's not like a more public area in Cairo. Now there are like more new compounds that are like like in Cairo or in Giza that are being expanded. It looks like more western in my opinion, but yet if you type that, it won't tell you that, and this is some kind of a bias. For me, that's a
Mm-hmm.
true bias. uh, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is really interesting. And I think that I can see that actually in like the visuals that you make. I mean, you have an example of that's one of your pictures that's behind you.
Yeah, but this is
Yeah.
but this is actually like California, so this is Laguna Beach, so it's not Cairo.
Oh, yeah. Um, well, because I think that that's also an interesting part of your artwork is I think it's like the housing. Because I think if I think to some of the pieces that I think had an impact on me, and I think you're right. Like, I don't think that you necessarily are trying to make a message or that your message is very um open to interpretation, which I think the best kind of art is. Like I'm thinking about like a facade that you've made and people are like living on the outside or sitting on the outside and you see very densely this facade is full of people on the outside. It gives you the impression that there's not enough space, not enough homes for people. But you're not necessarily saying that, you're just visually showing a bunch of people. And that's my interpretation of it. Someone else could have a different interpretation of it, which is I kind of think is interesting. Then also you have like this kind of these sort of tent-like structures, like the one I'm looking at behind you. I
Oh,
think I've seen a lot of that in your visuals too, where you have this build-up of, and I wonder whether the idea is that like, whatever you've input into like sort of AI systems to get those imagery, there are lots of imagery like that. So there is a truth to it. Like there are like structures like that in places around the world. And so putting them together, maybe that specifically one doesn't actually exist, but it could exist, I suppose.
I mean, for
I don't
me,
know
it's
if I'm,
some, yeah, I don't know. For me, it's like trying to find some form of like, I mean, my main interest is like, understanding architectural and visual vocabulary in general.
yeah,
And what I'm trying to do is basically like trying to use technology to find the vocabulary that describe some form of a reality that most architects will neglect, or like they will overlook, because they want to build like these fancy buildings. But like
yeah,
when we talk about like people that are like hanging on the facade, out the outer facade, it's actually me trying to find a vocabulary that connects people with architecture. Even maybe it's crazy, maybe it's so absurd, it's very abstract and artistic. But I think like if you want to create a new visual vocabulary, we need to kind of break the boundaries of like what is architecture, what is art, what is people, and that sort. Same thing about like this paint, this like this artwork here. This is from collections called Californication, which is basically again it's like investigating like the status of like homelessness in California, and the contrast
yep,
between how you can see like very beautiful buildings in Malibu, and then you can see like in downtown in Skid Row you can see like hundreds or thousands of like homeless tents away, and like with the current like impact of like the economy and everything, what's the future of like the middle class in California, which is again it's crazy to think about. um and I don't necessarily need to have a message, or I don't necessarily have to describe like a new form of architecture, but I
yeah,
think like again my endeavor is to try to find something that is kind of relevant. uh
yeah.
you know
Yeah, do you feel like you're like holding up a mirror in a way? Like you're showing this exists, this is what I see, this is also what I see. And you're just holding up a mirror and that kind of allows people to like I guess form conclusions or even just ask questions. I think questions are more interesting than the answers. That's kind of your point, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's more like a flashlight rather than like the mirror, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the flashlight is actually for me.
Mm.
If other people will share it, that's great. I'm happy to share it because I think like all ideas need to be put on the table at that moment. We
Yeah.
all need to like, because again, like these tools are they're gonna affect all of us one way or another. So
Yeah.
to have a dialogue, to have a conversation is really important. And if I have to, stand for one point that nobody's standing for, then I'll do that. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm right, but I think all ideas, like they are worth defending. So,
Tell me about this point that you made to me about cultures as interchangeable concepts that can only be pure when frozen in time and place. Like I feel like I've thought about that a lot too, in terms of so we talk about cultural identity. Like I grew up in the UK. My family's Arabic from like Iraq and Lebanon, and the idea of the culture that I have with me I guess is like what's been taken, like when my parents immigrated, when when they moved from the Middle East to the UK, what they took with them. So that was, however many years ago, let's say like 60 years ago. And the culture that I understand in terms of like Arabic culture, might be very different to what's in those countries now. So the idea of like, cultures being frozen in a time and place, I find that really interesting. Is that I guess how do you see that? And is that something that affects you in your life?
well, I mean, identities are reflections of people. If there are
Hmm.
no people, there will be no identities, right? People themselves are interchangeable. You're not the same person you were last year or the year before. And again, the world kind of changes you, and the world kind of changes the individual, and the individual changes the culture, and then the culture kind of put another feedback on the people that they live inside these cultures.
Hmm.
So again, if you want to really study or understand what culture is, you need to be really, really specific on when. If you want to judge yourself, you need to put, a pin on yourself on a certain circumstance. So, for example, like maybe I've done something that is stupid when I was in high school, but was it really stupid? I was in high school, so how can I judge it was like a good or a bad decision? Same thing. Like, what kind of person was I at that point?
Mm, yeah.
Um, Same thing
So
for,
context, basically.
yeah, exactly. You need to freeze it in time and in space, which makes, like, for me, identities are really, really important, but they are like, electrons that you're trying to shed light on them, and then whenever you shed a light on them, like, you can't find them anymore. You can't really measure an electron. Identities,
Yeah.
in a way, for me, are like that. Like, yeah, I'm Egyptian, but what the hell does an Egyptian mean?
Yeah.
Now, when I think about it now, in like about a month, the whole concept will change because Egypt itself, it's kind of changing. And,
Hmm.
you know, there's a lot of, like, I think like the sense of identity for most people is also nostalgic. So whenever you think about an
Hmm.
identity, you relate to yourself at one point in time, but that's like a personal identity. That's not like a collective identity. So this kind of
Hmm.
relationship between like individual identities and cultural identities, they are very, very connected to each other. However, it's really, really dangerous to inform one with the other,
Yes.
which is, I don't know, for me, that's kind of really, really fascinating because, yeah, you just like,
Yes.
you stay there and confuse. Yeah, identities are great, but what the hell is our identities in the first place?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
cool.
I think it's really cool too. This has been fascinating me as well, especially this idea of, I guess, let's say you think Egyptian, and let's say if you didn't go back to Egypt, right? So wherever you are now, like your idea of Egyptian is from your past and the people that you know around you who are also Egyptian. But then that's evolving at the same time as Egyptian in Egypt and people in Egypt who are, who are ever changing, evolving, and moving forward. And they just have the same name Egyptian, but they're two very different things. And, you know, you multiplied by all the other people around the world who have also like have a history from Egypt but are not there anymore. They've also like adapted their own like memories of Egypt from different times maybe. So like we use the same word. So like what I find interesting is what makes it Egyptian and what makes it like Hassan's Egyptian versus like Egyptian in like a town in Cairo, for example. Like I think that's kind of there's like it's not that they clash they might clash, but it's like what is more similar? Like what parts of those are similar? Like what makes it actually Egyptian? And I also think what and like another kind of thing that I think is interesting is the geography. Like if the country changes, let's say like I think about the history in Iraq, right? And like Iraq has actually changed geographically, and maybe specific places where my ancestors are from, wasn't called Iraq maybe when they were there, and it was part of like Persia or part of like the Ottoman Empire and all these different kind of things. Like what makes, is it the soil in that specific part of the ground, or is it something more cultural, like we all kind of like I eat the food that my ancestors ate or something like that.
Well, I don't know. Like basically, the countries, like we have the borders of the countries because of like colonization. Basically,
Yeah.
any imperialistic country, they had to set borders like for their colonies.
Hmm.
Before that, there was no borders. So like the
Yep.
the, the whole concept of identity was kind of a little bit absurd, really, at that point. I think I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist, but for them, yeah, you can relate to other people, but yeah, you just saw people like in maybe not that collectively, not like that clustered, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think like, I think the whole thing about like putting people in like, in groups is just something that you do when you have dominance or like when you have power and you want to control. So you need,
Yep.
like I don't know, imagine yourself like, doing a research project and you need to cluster everything, not connect them together. It's the same thing. If you're like
Hmm.
like I don't know, if you're English, for example, and you need to take control over the land and you need to, not to clash with your like big rivals like France or Spain, then you need to kind of, group things together and then put labels on them, and then people
Hmm.
will adjust to these labels. It's funny enough because
Yep.
this is actually the same thing that's happening with social media. Like people on social media, algorithms basically put people in clusters and age groups and demographics, and that's now you create some kind of like echo chamber, and now actually that's like creating a virtual culture, which is as true
Mm.
as like the other culture that is like the physical culture, like the intangible culture that we used to live in before the digital world. And again, like it's really important to understand that identities are in groups or human imposed ideas. They are not
Hmm.
something like, I don't think like,
Inherent.
yeah, I think like in inherent, of course, like there's the sense of group that like as all animals need to like be like together, like any social animal need to kind of belong to a group, but you
Yep.
don't really call a group unless you have power over like the outer group. Like if there's some kind of a clash of like some kind of a dominance. And
Yeah.
so again, thinking about this is kind of put another layer of like identities and like where they come from and how we should kind of move on with them. I, I
Yeah.
I have no idea what, yeah, I have no idea what to do with that, but again, I find
Yeah.
it like really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I totally understand what you're saying. And actually, like I'm also wonder how that translates visually, because I think about like one of your one of your collections. I can't remember the name of it, but there's a lot of these kind of bathrooms with Egyptian imagery set into the design of it.
Mhm.
And For anyone, I know that like if we're watching this, can go and have a look on your Instagram page and kind of like check out your website and see these visuals. But there's a very, very strong like, oh, this kind of looks Egyptian, but this is like maybe a Western bathroom. Um, and what do we do with that interesting mix? So visually, the coming together of certain like what does it mean is an interesting question of like, yeah, what does it mean? Like, why does that make you feel a certain way? Like, especially like these I saw a lot of your visuals of like I guess residential spaces with really beautiful bright colors. And they looked Egyptian to me, but I don't know why they look Egyptian to me. And I don't know where that comes from in my memory of, or does it just look Middle Eastern? Or does it just look like, is it taking a very surface level idea of like, a cultural identity, like I guess the aesthetic, like you can take the very surface of an aesthetic and make it sort of tack it onto something else and you go, Oh, there we go. That's Egyptian. But is it, and what makes it Egyptian? I guess that mix.
Yeah, I think what makes it Egyptian are like what people say it is, and what people say it is again based on like what they know about the subject or basically their bias. So
Mm,
again, what is Egyptian? Like, well, it's like for most people around the world, when you see like Egypt, they associate it with like the pharaohs and the ancient Egyptian art or like the
mm-hmm,
pyramids, but that's not really Egypt. That's like
mm-hmm,
part of the history of Egypt. Egypt right now is very, very different. Like the houses inside
mm-hmm.
of Egypt, they don't look like my work at all. You know, and
Yep.
again, it's not about like authenticity here. It's just about understanding the bias really and how like informing like the visual vocabulary, even like for me, like what makes a house Egyptian. I have no idea other than the feeling that I know coming from a middle class family in Egypt, going into like different houses, and I know
Mm-hmm.
like the shared aesthetics that are there. You can see that maybe in movies or in cinema, like the Arabic cinema, but if you don't really watch that, you wouldn't really know, right? and
Yep.
and it's interesting because the aesthetics that were formed in that duration of like me growing up, it excuse me, it was also shared aesthetics with the world, because again it was based on like modernism, it was based on like the media, and now there was Hollywood and people trying to mimicking the houses in Hollywood, and there was
Mm-hmm.
like an age of industrialization and exports, and now you need like to find a market and using Hollywood as like a way to sell your products or like compete like I think at what yeah, I remember like when I was young and my father was a marine captain who was traveling a lot, and there was some kind of a rivalry that I always sensed between when dad went like to the United States or went to Japan, and the quality of the
Mm-hmm.
products that he always brought. And it's funny because now everybody kind of following the same kind of mentality or aesthetics.
Yep.
So everything like identities that I know about is shared. So
Mm-hmm.
how who am I to say, or whom anybody to say that something is Egyptian? So like
Mm-hmm.
ancient Egypt is Egyptian as it's frozen in history. So I think you can
Mm-hmm.
judge something by like when you freeze it in time. Like
Yep.
like we have a lot like like downtown Cairo was all built during like Muhammad Ali and the Ottoman Empire, like like branch of an Ottoman Empire which based on like the great Muhammad Ali and then like Khedive Ismail and like all these like ancestries. They are all Europeans, but it's imposed like some kind of a style in Egypt. Same thing in
Yes.
Alexandria, an Hellenistic style in Alexandria. Is it really Egyptian? No, like the whole Alexandria was built by Greek, So is it Egyptian
Right.
or is it Greek?
Yep.
I have no
Yeah.
like yeah I have no idea. Like I could be like more Greek than I am Egyptian. I have no
Yep.
idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I totally understand what you mean. And then and those the name of these groups, like I kind of sometimes wonder like are they actually more in some ways can they be restrictive? If you say that this is that like, this is Egyptian and therefore this isn't Egyptian and you could say, well, why does that matter? Does it mean it's less valid or, are you wrong?
Mhm,
Like this is
mhm,
all that, if an Egyptian person makes a bunch of things, if you make something that then inherently it is an Egyptian because it comes from you, the question of like what these categories mean, I guess. Like,
yeah,
do you
yeah.
feel like it could be restrictive?
It's not. I'm trying to understand what you mean by restrictive. Maybe I'm.
Like if someone says, like, okay, like in a way, sometimes I think about growing up and I wanted to do something, and let's say, oh, girls don't do that. Well, well, if I'm a girl and I want to
Mm,
do that, then girls do that. But if you say girls don't do
oh,
that, I mean girls can't do that. So like, the
okay.
idea of this is the category you're in, and you're not allowed to go outside of it because it doesn't compute with the category I've put you in.
Um, yeah, well, if you're talking about like this in art and architecture, as an artist, you need to break this kind of boundary in the first place. If you can break it,
Hmm.
you won't do anything that is interesting. If I'm understanding your question correctly, as in
Yeah.
I think like in the age of globalization, um, this kind of you're not restricted by your identity, but you're restricted by context. Like for example, as an architect, you'll most probably be restricted with the investor and the money that's put on the table. So like if especially in architecture, because you can't really go and build your own building. You can just, as an artist, you can go and paint your own painting. As a product designer, maybe you can do like a couple of prototypes, but as an architect, you can't really do that unless you're Zaha Hadid or something. But so like for architects, I think you're really restricted by almost everything.
Yeah.
Almost all the architects that I know, they are not creative. They are restricted, but they are not restricted by identities. They are restricted by the market that they are in, and they are restricted by the studios and the clients. They are not really expressing themselves. I can argue like it's like 99.9999% of all architects that ever lived were restricted by their context. Which is basically at that point they're just like doing a service. Like people need a house, I'll just build you a house. You know, it's not really creative. Should architects be creative or no? That's another question. What I'm trying to say is that restriction can make sense at some points, but if you want to break the boundaries, you can't be restricted to anything really.
Yeah. So coming back to the idea of identity on the verge of collapse, do you think that the collapse could be a positive thing in the way of like breaking boundaries of identity? Do you think that that's necessarily a negative thing, or do you think there's positive in that?
I think when I meant it, there was like some negativity to it. I have to admit that. In the sense of like, I hate the age of like that we live in where everything kind of looks the same. You know, especially if you're now like employing more technology into what we do, and you know, creating AIs and robots. I don't know. Have you ever seen the movie called Equilibrium?
No.
It was Christian Bale was in that movie. So they lived like in a dystopian world, and where like they banned emotions. So you can't feel anything. You have to take like some form of a drug, and you can't feel anything. And there was judges that they went in, and if you see like that you're feeling something, feeling bad, if you're feeling sad, if you owned any piece of art that makes you feel anything, you're gonna be banned. You're gonna be killed, executed. You can't feel. Because it's just safe not to feel. Because if you felt, you'll be dangerous. You know.
Right.
And I don't know. Like if everything looked the same, if we felt the same thing, then basically we're heading into that scenario. Of course, like not to that extent, but basically, like you see a lot of arguments about like the machines taking over people's jobs and whatever. But actually, we've been cultivating a world that is training people as machines themselves. We're turning people into robots. You need to work out. You need to always feel positive. You need to get great money. You need to be great with everybody. You know, you need to control your feelings and what sort. And that's kind of reflecting on like what the architecture are we doing. You can't really express yourself. You need to go. You need to work at a good studio, and you need to make a good amount of money. You need to make like this kind of modern house. The expression or like the vocabulary that you need to express and need to be confined within like the limits of the material that we can use and the economy and the aesthetics that we're using. And I really hate that, I really did hate that. And that's basically what I'm saying about like when identity on the verge of collapse is that with AI especially and with bias, there's an absence of like, this kind of different vocabulary and all. I don't know, for me, if you went like in any hashtag for like, AI in architecture, you most probably see the aesthetics kind of fall more or less around the same thing, which is like a post-Zaha fluid nature, like aesthetics, which is again, I'm not against that. I'm just against that everything kind of looks like that. And with the bias and like with the limitation of like, that was the AI, basically, like the shortcomings of AI of not being able to produce certain things. It will only head towards that direction and what that will mean towards our identity and what we believe in. And that's, and also that this is kind of was combined with other, I don't know, maybe social and political aspects that I had in mind about like what is like identity and how they transform and how everything kind of looks the same. So I think when I put that title, I think it was negative. Of course, like it doesn't. I don't think everything like absolute. Like there's no absolute good or no absolute bad. It's just like really, really relative. But for me at that point, I just didn't really like that.
Yeah. I think it's a really great title because I think that I also understood it to be negative. And then just as we were having that conversation, I looked at it again and I thought, oh, in a way, it's almost like breaking barriers, even because the word collapse means it's falling down. But if you
Mm.
said breaking through identity barriers, for example, it would be, I guess it would be deliberate, and that could be a positive thing versus losing your identity, so it's collapsing because everything becomes the same. That's a neg you know
Mm.
that's like something that you haven't got any control over. Maybe that's the difference.
Interesting. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting because I like a friend of mine was talking about the same thing. Is that yeah, maybe the title is negative, but actually what you're trying to do here is not really negative. So it's something doesn't make sense. And when I think about it, I think you're right because like this kind of collection that's kind of being evolving into like actually discovering visual vocabulary that's the
Hmm.
coming from all of like what really makes something that's Egyptian combined along with the bias. So it's not so it's actually about breaking boundaries. So I think you're
Yeah.
correct. But like in the heart of it, when I created it, I don't know. Maybe I'm just like a pessimist person, but I'm actually trying to do a good thing. So it can
No,
take both meanings. No,
no,
no.
but I don't think your artwork or the stuff that you discuss comes across as pessimistic at all. I think actually you're very optimistic because I think that even in the exploration of these topics is very optimistic to have like an identity that you want to keep alive, like that's a because I think a lot of people either don't think about these things or have already decided, oh, everything's changing. Oh, the world is going to die anyway. It's fine. But actually, to like when people are trying to like interrogate, like, why is this important? Is this important? I think these are important things to put up, and it's like forcing people to have a look at it. Like, yeah,
Mm,
like you said, the flashlight. I love that analogy. Actually, we need more of that.
maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Hassan. It's been a really interesting conversation. I feel like, well, I could like keep talking to you for like another hour about all the different. I mean, I find this topic really interesting, and I sometimes wonder how to, because I'm a visual person, a visual artist, and when I think about these kind of topics, I think, how could I put that down visually? Like, I don't know how that translates. And your work actually is a good example of, I mean, it translates for you what you're saying, but I kind of like feel very inspired to sort of put some kind of visual down that explains what I mean. But I don't know how I would do that. But yeah, I'm excited to see um, more of your work, more of the collections, and anyone else who's watching this or listening to this should go check out. I'll put your website in the notes here, and so people can check out your work. That's great. And where can people find you, just in case? What's your website?
You mean online? It's
Yeah.
hsnrgb.com. So it's like my name, my first name and last name without the vowels, basically.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
you're on Instagram as well.
yeah, same handle, yeah, same thing.
Yeah,
hsnrgb.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hassan. It's been great chatting to you, and hopefully you'll come back maybe in another year's time, and we'll have a whole lot of other interesting topics to talk about.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me. Yeah, it's been fun.
That was a great conversation I had with Hassan. It was cool having him back. We had the chance to go into more depth about the ideas around identity and visuals. So thank you for listening. Please share this podcast with your friends if you think that they would be interested, and feel free to get in touch with any suggestions of topics that you'd like me to discuss. I'm always open to suggestions. I'll see you back here in 2 weeks. Bye.